Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to join you today. This is actually my first talk about my new book. In fact, it's my first virtual talk altogether, so I hope you'll bear with me. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you the story of Endell Street Military Hospital, as told in my book, Endell Street, as it's titled in the UK, No Man's Land, as it's coming out soon in America. Well, I'm sorry that we can't all be in Benjamin Franklin House itself at the moment. We are living through extraordinary times, and the story that I'm going to talk about has, I think, many parallels for us today. Some of you have probably already visited Benjamin Franklin's house in Craven Street, or maybe had a virtual tour. That's the house where he lived in London for nearly 16 years, from 1757 to 1775. And if you have visited, you can perhaps picture Ben in this beautiful, airy and elegant Georgian house at 36 Craven Street in the 18th century. But I want you to imagine Craven Street at a different time, at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Well, Craven Street was and is right next door to Charing Cross Station. That was one of the major railway termini where the wounded arrived on ambulance trains from the front in the First World War. And in the painting, you can see the crowds gathered at the station concourse as the ambulances emerged from the station carrying wounded soldiers to take them to hospitals nearby in London. The closest hospital to Charing Cross Station and to Craven Street was Charing Cross Hospital on the corner of the Strand and Agar Street. There's a photograph of the hospital. You can see it on the right, and across the street a banner was strung appealing for pedestrians to be quiet for the wounded, so the wounded soldiers could sleep inside. But many of those ambulances that were emerging from Charing Cross Station and turning right along the Strand were heading for a different hospital. They were going for a very different hospital. They were headed for Endell Street Military Hospital in Covent Garden, just 5 or 10 minutes walk from Craven Street. Well, this was the gate through which those ambulances drove. And for the wounded men who came through that gate and were then lifted out of the ambulances in the courtyard that you can just about see beyond, the scene that met them was astonishing. It was completely beyond their imagining, because Endell Street Military Hospital was run and staffed entirely by women. Apart from the special constable at the gate and a dozen or so other male ancillary staff, the hospital was run and staffed completely by women. So the wounded men were lifted from the ambulances by women stretcher bearers who took them up to the wards. They were greeted on the wards by female nurses, naturally. Then they were checked over by women doctors, operated on by women surgeons, and looked after throughout their stay by women. It was the only military hospital under the auspices of the British Army to be run and staffed by women. And the story about how the hospital came about is a remarkable example of courage, determination and stamina, which I think speaks volumes to us still today. Well, when war broke out in August 1914, thousands of men signed up to fight. And women signed up in their thousands too, as volunteers in every capacity. They worked in farms, in factories and in public transport, like this conductorette, as she was known. But women doctors volunteered too. Within 10 days of war being declared, more than 60 women doctors offered their services to the War Office, but their help was bluntly rejected. One female doctor, the Scottish surgeon called Elsie Ingalls, volunteered her services to the army, and she was told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." Well, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson refused to sit still. They were both qualified doctors with 10 years experience each. Flora, you can see in the centre of the photograph on the left, was a physician and anaesthetist. Louisa, you can see third from the left in the second photograph, she was a surgeon. But as women doctors, they were only allowed to treat women and children. So they ran a 7-bed hospital for children in a poor area of London, and they had small private practices. Women in the UK had won the right to qualify in medicine several decades earlier. Louisa's mother, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who's walking next to her in the photograph, she had been the first woman to qualify in Britain to join the medical register in 1865. But at the start of the war, women doctors were still confined to treating only women and children. No jobs were offered to women doctors in mainstream hospitals. Women were not allowed to treat men, and they rarely worked in surgery. Well, given such prejudice, it's not surprising that both Flora and Louisa had become suffragettes. Louisa had served 4 weeks in Holloway Prison for smashing a window. Flora had been Emmeline Pankhurst's doctor, and she treated many suffragettes for the ill effects of force feeding. And they were also life partners. They wore identical diamond rings, and they lived together in the manner of a married couple. So they stood shoulder to shoulder in the women's battle for equality. But when the war broke out, the suffragettes suspended their battle for the vote. And they worked together to support their country in the fight against a common enemy. Flora and Louisa were just as keen as any male doctor to serve their country, but they also saw war as an opportunity. It was a chance to prove that women doctors were equal to their male colleagues. They didn't waste time approaching the army because they knew they would be rejected. So instead, they offered their services to the French Red Cross, who were happy to accept. They raised £2,000 in a few weeks. They bought medical supplies. They recruited a team of like-minded women and kitted them out with uniforms. And then on the 15th of September, so just 6 weeks after the start of the war, Flora and Louisa set off with their team for France. And they called their unit the Women's Hospital Corps. And in addition to Flora and Louisa, there were 3 women doctors who are pictured in this photograph, 8 nurses, and 3 women orderlies. Plus they had 4 male helpers, male nurses. When they arrived in Paris, they were given an empty luxury hotel, the Hotel Claridge in the Champs-Élysées. The hotel was absolutely brand new, but it had never opened, never been used. But so the plaster on the walls was still wet. But within 48 hours, they had all scrubbed the floors, set up camp beds, and converted this hotel into a 100-bed emergency hospital. So they turned the stylish salons and dining rooms into wards, and the ladies' cloakroom became the operating theatre. You can see in this photograph during operation. They turned the grill room into a mortuary. And on the second night after they'd moved into carriages, the wounded soldiers began to pour in. So they were British and French soldiers from the front line, roughly 60 miles from Paris. But the women doctors were, of course, dangerously inexperienced. They had no experience of military surgery at all, very little experience of major surgery even, and they had never before treated men. But they learned quickly, and in any case, the wounds and the conditions that they were having to treat were unprecedented. So no doctors, male or female, had previously encountered the scale of casualties and the extent of wounds that the First World War unleashed. The men had huge gaping wounds, horrific head injuries, multiple compound fractures, extensive gangrene in almost all the wounds, and some of them were already suffering from shell shock. Well, to begin with, army officials who came to visit were hostile to the idea of a hospital that was staffed by women. But after they'd visited, they were so impressed that they became strong allies and advocates for the women's work. So when the women set up a second hospital near Boulogne, the army gave this official status. The second hospital opened with 50 beds in November 1914 in a small hotel called the Chateau Mauricienne in Wimereux, about 4 miles from Boulogne. And the postcard shows the hotel in rather more tranquil times. So this was the first hospital that was staffed by women to operate under the auspices of the army. They had army rations, they had to work by army rules, they were subject to army discipline. And at the Chateau Mauricienne, the women treated women from the first back at Boulogne. And then in early 1915, Flora and Louisa were invited to a meeting at the War Office in London with Sir Alfred Keogh, head of the Royal Army Military Corps, who was the most senior doctor in the British Army. Keogh had heard about their work in France from army chiefs there, and he made an astonishing request to them. He asked them to run a major military hospital in the heart of London. But they accepted immediately. They knew that this was their real chance to prove that women doctors were every bit as skilled as their male colleagues. They closed their units in France and they moved back to London. Endell Street Military Hospital opened in May 1915 in a former workhouse in Covent Garden. It had 520 beds, later that increased to 573 in 17 wards, and it was unique. So there were 14 doctors in Endell Street, 29 trained nurses and more than 80 orderlies. And the orderlies did most of the work. So they were nursing assistants, stretcher bearers, cooks, cleaners and clerks. Most of them were middle class or upper class women, so they'd never previously really boiled an egg, let alone empty a bedpan. Some of them used to be dropped off in the morning outside Endell Street in chauffeured cars, and they were picked up at the end of the day by their chauffeurs too. But regardless of their background, all the women wore the Endell Street uniform. They were paid army pay and allowances and given honorary military rank. So the month that Endell Street opened in May 1915, more than 43,000 sick and wounded arrived in the UK from France and beyond. The army hospital system was close to breaking point. Ultimately, there were more than 300 hospitals in London receiving wounded soldiers. But Endell Street was one of the 20 biggest hospitals in the capital, and in central London it was one of the 10 biggest. And because of its proximity to Charing Cross Station, it was receiving some of the most serious cases. But Endell Street was regarded as a huge gamble. Sir Alfred Keogh had been warned when he first invited the women to run a hospital that it would not last 6 months. And indeed, the army really put every obstacle in the women's way, and they were as unhelpful as possible. But Endell Street not only survived 6 months, it was hailed as a triumph. But at the same time, it was exhausting and grueling work. The convoys of wounded men usually arrived in the middle of the night, so the imminent arrival of a convoy would be announced by a bell ringing in the courtyard, and then the orderlies who were sleeping on site would have to quickly get dressed and then assemble in the courtyard, standing to attention. And then up to 80 men would arrive at the same time. The doctors were performing between 20 and 30 operations a day. They were admitting between 400 and 800 cases a month. Some of the men who arrived and were unloaded at those ambulance vans were so shocked to see women doctors that they thought they'd been sent there to die. They couldn't think of any other explanation for having been sent to a women-run hospital. But before long, they not only accepted the hospital, they decided that it was the best in London. Some men even asked to be sent there when they were wounded. Newspapers responded likewise. To begin with, the press really regarded Endell Street as a curiosity, but that changed quickly, and very soon Endell Street was being held up as an example of the fighting spirit of Blighty. So there were articles that described the hospital as the most popular and the most successful in London. Endell Street was also renowned for its efficient organisation and professional care. The staff treated throughout the war more than 26,000 wounded, and the vast majority of them were men from the front line, but there were also about 2,000 women who eventually were working in France. The doctors performed more than 7,000 major operations, often having to operate between 8 and 9 hours a day. And this is an absolutely remarkable painting. It's the reason I first decided to write the book, when I saw this picture and was just intrigued by the scene. They introduced pioneering medical treatments. Louisa Garrett Anderson and the Endell Street pathologist Helen Chambers trialled a new antiseptic ointment to tackle the severely infected wounds that they saw. It was called bismuth iodoform paraffin paste, known as BIP for short. And because it was a paste, it could be kept in place in a wound for longer, as much as 10 days. And it not only healed the wounds efficiently, but because it was needed to be changed less often, it was much less painful for the men. And they first trialled BIP in 1916 on some of the first wounded men coming back from the Somme. And they published their results a few months later in the Lancet. But Endell Street was also famous for its homely atmosphere. The wards were airy and bright with colourful bed quilts, standard lamps and fresh flowers. The courtyard was turned into a tranquil green haven where the men could relax and have entertainments too. So this picture, which was used as a postcard, depicts a bank holiday festivity. There was also a library with 5,000 books, which you can see on the bottom right. And the hospital had a theatre where they hosted hundreds of entertainments, including concerts, magic acts, and pantomimes. They had more than 1,000 entertainers who were visiting every year. And also to keep the men occupied and as a form of occupational therapy, they taught the men knitting and needlework. And some of the embroidery that the men did actually still survives today. But it was not easy work for the women. As the war ground on, the women came under attack from air raids, from Zeppelins and German planes. They were suffering food shortages. They were extremely tired. And inevitably there were tensions among the staff too, sometimes arguments. Flora and Louisa were very strict disciplinarians. They were quite tough taskmasters. The women who worked for them were in awe of them, but they were also sometimes afraid of them. One of the orderlies said that they were expected to be not only as good as men, but better. But it was exhilarating work too. The women were enjoying the chance for the first time to do something that they were good at, working together for a common cause. When the war ended, Endell Street stayed open for another year, treating the victims of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. And really that was the darkest time for the staff. The pandemic caused between 50 million and 100 million deaths worldwide. It came in 3 waves. So the second wave, which was the most lethal, arrived in this country in November 1918, so the time of the armistice. At that point, there were nearly 30,000 people dying in a single week. And at Endell Street, now between 50 and 60 patients were ill at one time, and many of the staff were also affected. The third wave, which arrived in January 1919, was really for them the hardest, because a record number of 30 patients died at Endell Street in February at that time, and there were 22 staff who felt ill during the whole pandemic, including at least 4 of them who died. But the women at Endell Street, they trialled face masks, they segregated patients and screened off beds. So they were pioneering some of the most up-to-date ways of trying to protect the staff and the patients. Well, the doors closed finally in January 1920, so 100 years ago this year. And the war had changed everything and nothing, because the women doctors, in fact all the hospital's women staff, were now expected to go back to exactly the roles that they had performed before. Most mainstream medical schools now close their doors to women again. Most general hospitals refuse to appoint women doctors again. And most of the women doctors who had worked at Endell Street, gaining all that incredible experience, now had to go back to treating women and children, or work abroad, or retire. So it would take many more decades before women in medicine won equality. Well, Flora and Louisa carried on working for a few more years after Endell Street closed, and then they retired to the countryside. Flora died in 1923. I think she was probably worn out by the war and her work. She had a military funeral, and the last post was sounded at her grave. And then Louisa lived on alone for another 20 years. She actually worked in a casualty department during the Second World War, and then she died in 1943. And at that point, an inscription was added to the stone at Flora's grave, which said, "We have been gloriously happy." Well, my book is a tribute to all the women who worked at Endell Street and all the men who were treated there. And I wrote it to give voice to them, and also because I do think that it speaks to us today still about the extremes of human endurance, of love, of pain, sorrow, sacrifice, but also courage, dedication, and compassion, and the simple joy of being alive. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Wendy. I did mention while you were temporarily away that your book is available for purchase online. So if they'd like to learn more about what you've just discussed, then it is available for people to buy now. So we have time for questions now. So you have 2 options for those who are listening. You can either choose to ask a question in the Q&A section down there, or if you'd like to raise your hand, you can be called on and you can actually directly ask Wendy any questions. So yes, the floor is open to everybody. Sorry, just seeing. Okay, so we have a question from Anne Bagamary, who has said, "Why was Endell Street so well stocked with books and facilities?"
Well, because the women believed that the men needed to be healed in body and mind. So that was Louisa's very firm view. She believed in providing the most professional care, medical care, but also in trying to give the men activities to distract them, to keep their spirits up and to keep them motivated. So having a library was one of the key elements of that. They had 2 more or less full-time librarians, sometimes 3, and they would go around the wards and ask the men what they wanted to read. Some of the men were actually illiterate or just really didn't want to read. They were too shocked. So they would gently encourage them by giving them magazines and maybe cheap paperbacks, and then gradually some of them, graduated to Shakespeare and Dickens. So that's why they introduced needlework classes as well. They wanted to keep the men's spirits up.
Great. Thank you very much for answering that. I'm now going to call on Eleanor Hamblin to ask a question.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks so much for that fascinating talk. I was really interested in when you mentioned about the orderlies at the hospital and how a lot of them came from middle class or upper class backgrounds. And I just wondered if you knew anything about their stories after their time at the hospital, kind of if any of them, it sort of changed their path, as it were, and they went on to seek out careers.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I said I wanted to give voice to the staff at Endell Street. That was not just the doctors, but also the nurses and the various orderlies. So I did manage to get in contact with various families whose grandmothers and great aunts had actually worked at Endell Street, and managed to be able to follow them in their later lives. One of them, for example, she was a young woman of 20 called Nina Last. Her sister Barbara also worked at Endell Street. So they were orderlies, they helped with nursing and other activities. Nina left a description of her time at the hospital, and she also left her uniform, so her uniform still survives. So she's one of the reasons that we know quite a bit about life at the hospital for the ordinary orderlies. But after the war, the vast majority of those women really went back to doing exactly the same lives they'd had before. So a lot of them spent their time going to tea parties, playing tennis, lives of leisure, but not really fulfilled lives. So in later life, a lot of them look back and they said that Endell Street was the happiest time of their life. Some of them married. Nina herself married and didn't have a very happy time. But yeah, there were very few women that really went on to have significant careers.
Thank you.
Okay. The next question we have is, did Endell Street have women patients as well?
Yes, there were, as I mentioned, about 2,000 women patients who were treated there. So to begin with, all the patients were men. But from about 1917 onwards, the army set up special auxiliary services to recruit women. So that was the RACs. There was also the Air Force, the RAF, and the Navy, the Wrens. So women enlisted to work in these branches and went to France, many of them. And some of them at various times came under attack. They weren't directly in the front line, but they were at base hospitals and other places which came under attack from air raids. And so some of them then became patients, and Endell Street was a hospital that they were sent to. So one ward, at times two wards, were then devoted to the women. Some of them died there too of their wounds. Later on, there were other places that they could go to. But during the flu epidemic as well, Endell Street did take in civilian people from the local areas. So there were men and women who came then as well.
That's really interesting. So the next question that we have is from Sarah Haslam, who asked, who is the most compelling character for you in this story?
That's a lovely story. Thank you, Sarah. I felt as if I became very close to a lot of the women in the story. Flora and Louisa themselves were formidable women, but it was very hard to get to know them personally in the same way as some of the other women who perhaps left more candid descriptions of their time. So I think the person for me who I felt closest to was an Australian surgeon who was called Vera Scantlebury. And she travelled from Melbourne specifically to work at Endell Street. And when she got there, she'd previously worked in a children's hospital, so she only had experience of working with children, and she loved that job. She came to work at Endell Street because she felt it was her duty to do so. And she was frankly quite shocked by what she found. She hated military surgery, and in her letters home, she was very honest about her feelings, about her fears, her doubts about her own abilities, and also about the women that she worked with. So from reading her diaries at great length, I feel that I got to know her really well, and felt her grow as she went along and gained confidence.
So the next question is, after the war, did any of the remaining London hospitals adopt any of the Endell Street innovations in patient care, if you're aware?
That's quite an interesting question. Not as far as I know. I think the reason Endell Street was regarded as being quite special was because it wasn't a military hospital. So Flora Murray in particular was very specific that it wasn't a women's hospital, it wasn't a women's military hospital, it was a military hospital just the same as the others. But at the same time, they wanted it both ways, really, because they also were keen to press home how much it had a kind of womanly touch. So it had this sort of very homely, very domesticated feel to it. So it was very different. So to be honest, I mean, because after the war, women doctors again were shut out of working in hospitals, hospitals went back to how they had been previously, and I really don't know of any particular innovations that carried on afterwards.
Okay. So the next question we have is, why do you think that the French Red Cross was more willing to accept the women team?
Well, one of the explanations is possibly that it was a bit of a mistake, because the women wrote to the French Red Cross and offered to take a medical unit to France, and the women themselves admitted that they may have misunderstood, and in fact thought the women were just going to fund a unit of male doctors that they were going to take to France. I mean, in France, they were no more accepted of women doctors. In fact, there were fewer women doctors. Women doctors in France didn't ever work in the army during the First World War. So I think the French were just as surprised as anybody else to discover this unit of women arriving and setting up in Claridge's Hotel.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about that, actually. So the next question is from Dawn Kemp, who says, you mentioned Elsie Inglis, who is a suffragist. Can you tell if Flora and Louisa attracted suffragette women to work with them more than suffragists?
Yeah, very, very interesting question too, because while researching Endell Street, it became clear to me that Endell Street was seen as the suffragettes' hospital. So Flora and Louisa had been active members of Mrs. Pankhurst's WSPU, so they were suffragettes. They supported action, although they had left the WSPU by the time that the First World War started, because they seemingly thought things had gone too far. Elsie Inglis was a prominent member of the Suffragists, the National Union of Women's, I can't remember the National Union of Women Suffragette Societies. I'm getting confused now. So she set up the Scottish Women's Hospitals, which was a similar organisation which took medical units to France, but also to Serbia and Russia. And that was very much seen as the suffragists' unit. So really the NUWSS was raising money for the Scottish Women's Hospitals, whereas Endell Street was linked much more with the suffragettes. But really, I don't think that distinction followed on to the staff that worked in the various hospitals, because quite a lot of the women who worked at Endell Street didn't identify themselves as suffragettes, or probably even as suffragists. They just worked there because they wanted to help. They saw it as a great opportunity to do something. And likewise, there were women who went with the Scottish Women's Hospitals to work in Serbia, who had been active as suffragettes. So in reality, there wasn't that distinction.
So the next question is from Kate Hamblin, who asks, do you know of any comparable hospitals run by women in other countries at the time?
Sorry, any comparable?
Hospitals run by women in other countries at the time.
Okay, so Endell Street was the only hospital I've ever heard of that was run as a proper army hospital, so within an army. There were other hospitals. The Scottish Women's Hospitals were the biggest unit, so they did take women-run hospitals, women-staffed hospitals to France and Serbia and Russia, and so they had several hospitals that were running, but they were separate from the government, the army setup. Later on, really, as a result of seeing that women doctors were, doing a job just as good as their male counterparts, the British Army did then recruit women doctors directly into the army. So they went off to work in Malta and Egypt and elsewhere, but they didn't have a very happy experience at all. They were treated very differently. They were not given the same pay as army male doctors. They were not allowed to wear army uniform or army insignia. Some of them complained that they were having to sit in third-class railway carriages on their travels. They weren't allowed to eat with the male army officers in the mess tent. So they were never properly accepted. So yeah, I don't know of any other hospitals that were equivalent exactly to Endell Street, no.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering those questions, Wendy. That's all the time that we have today. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. And as I mentioned before, I do recommend for everybody to, if they can, to buy the book on any online retailer that they can. Yes, so thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about the slight temporary hitch, but it's been a pleasure to join everybody. Thank you.